Well, this is one of these things where you hear a paper and then you totally change what you're going to talk about. Because one of the things that that John talked about in his very interesting lecture was that the whole thing of Smuts sort of thinking, should I go and get a field command and go to the Middle East? And Robertson says to him, no, don't do that. That's not an interesting place to go. You're not going to get the manpower that you need. Now, as this photograph shows, the British Empire does end up with the manpower to do a successful offensive in the Middle East, in Palestine, in 1918, which leads to the surrender of the Ottoman army. But as you can see, this army which does it is not an army of white soldiers, but is an Indianised army. That in 1918, the army of the EEF, the Eastern Expeditionary Force, is essentially Indianised, so that 80% of the divisions have Indian troops in them. So this is a radical change, and this is the thing I'm going to be talking about in this 10 minutes that I have. I'm looking at the way in which the British Empire changes its views of who is suitable to be a soldier. And this all comes about, I think, as a result of the experience of 1915. So if you look at the British Empire's casualties on the Western Front in 1915, where you see the battles of Aubers Ridge and Festubert and Loos, is that the casualties they lose is just under 300,000 troops in that 1 year. In October of 1915, Andrew Bonar-Law, who John mentioned in his lecture, who was then the colonial secretary, the British colonial secretary, he puts forward a proposal as a response to these casualties which have been happening during 1915 to, quote, that we should be raising troops in large numbers in our colonies and protectorates for imperial service. So up until now, the British Army had that white force of the British Expeditionary Force. You had the Indian troops who had part of the Indian Corps which had arrived in France in 1914, and then would later the Indian troops would then be withdrawn to take part in the Mesopotamia campaign. But this was then also to say to go to other troops which had not been considered to be sufficiently martial to enlist. You can look at this broadening the base of recruiting, which happens in 1915 in two ways. One way is to say this is a recognition of equality across the empire, but the other side of it is that sometimes, and I'm going to talk then about the introduction of conscription, both a formal conscription like you have in Jamaica, as I'll talk to in a second, and also informal, as you have in, say, the recruiting of the South African Native Labour Corps in South Africa in 1917 and so on. That this conscription is also a form of coercing the population to infer revolt, the possibility of revolt in places like Jamaica, and also within populations in other colonies. So, as a response to this call that Bonar-Law makes, on the 25th of October 1915, King George V puts forward a call, and I quote, for men of all classes to come forward voluntarily and take your share in the fight. So he's doing this to the whole of the empire. In places like Jamaica, this is seen as a possibility to gain a form of equality. Jamaica at this period was a colony which was 98% Afro-Caribbean, and the Jamaican poet Tom Redcam, in response to what the king said, wrote a poem which said, and this is parts of it, listen to the words of the king, listen to the summons they bring. Patriots, stand up for the right, buckle your armour for fight. And this is just cut a few lines. Heedless of race, rank or creed, mindful of duty alone. So one of the things which happens in 1915 is that we end up with the creation of what is called the British West Indies Regiment, which is different to the British West India Regiment, which was a part of a regular army, which had been established, I think, during the wars against Napoleon. But you end up with the recruiting of troops to Jamaica. Many of these work as labour troops, but those which find themselves in Palestine in 1918 actually serve as combat troops and find themselves fighting alongside Australians, which is something I'll come to towards the end. The other aspect of this is the increased use of African troops in the campaigns in East Africa. So I think John may have been a bit too generous towards General Smuts in his discussion of the East African campaign. This is an attempt to conquer the colony of German East Africa. The first attempt to do this is done with Indian troops in 1914, which fails. The second attempt happens towards the end of 1915 or early 1916, where we have the South African. You end up with a source which is mostly a white army of South Africans, but includes some Australians who are working on the veldt in mining. That fails because of illness among the troops and also the horses. Smuts thought they all should be mounted troops, and didn't realise you're going to Tsetse country, and that's not very good for horses. The final force which ends up fighting in East Africa is an African force. Troops from East Africa, the King's African Rifles, and also from West Africa, including Nigerian troops. It's interesting with these Nigerian troops because you can see this shift, which comes alongside the Indianisation of the EEF in 1918, is also in 1918 the creation of a force which is called the 1st West African Frontier Force Service Brigade. And this is a unit of West African troops who are being trained with modern equipment such as Stokes mortars and machine guns to be serving, and the quote from the Colonial Secretary is, they will be regarded as available for service anywhere except German troops in Europe. These troops end up never actually going anywhere. This force which has been recruited, mostly I think because of shipping issues. But the plan was that they would go to Palestine, and they would have fought as part of the Palestine campaign and fighting as part of a modern army. So to finish up, what are we to make of this? So you can see that there is this shift within British thinking, military thinking, to accept the use of non-white troops, the African troops which fight there, the Indian troops who fight in Palestine. One of the things which doesn't happen is the fact that, say, for people from Jamaica, who the battalions which come back from the war, is that they end up getting any great benefit from their war service. What happens is when the troops come back is that they get allowed to vote in the first election, which is held after the peace in Jamaica. After that, their voting rates are withdrawn. The other concern that the Jamaican government has is that suddenly you've got tens of thousands of troops who have military training and they're afraid of revolt. And so they create a scheme where they encourage Jamaican military veterans to migrate somewhere else. Go to Cuba, smoke cigars, go to the Panama Canal and work on the locks of the Panama Canal. And you end up, and I think it shows for the Jamaican soldiers, they could see there was no real future there. And you end up with 55% of the returned soldiers end up leaving Jamaica because they can see no future for them there. To finish up, well, where would we go from here, is that when you're going to be finding the experience of these non-white soldiers, it's often not going to be necessarily in papers of people who may not be literate, but you're going to see it in the census records. And it's, say, the work which David Amisi has done with Indian soldiers, There's Andrew Java, who recently wrote a book looking at the census records of newspapers in Punjab during the First World War. These are probably the ways in which we'll try and uncover the experience of these soldiers in the First World War. Thank you.